So Preston, they finally started casting for Fire and Blood, finally, and there is some news, kind of a rumor, basically, of some of the people they might be casting
Okay.
for the whole thing, and this kind of annoys me because
I'm surprised they've even gotten to casting, but okay.
why are you surprised?
Well, one, COVID, but two, it's just, these things take forever. I mean, it's supposed to come out in 2022 or something, so
That's what the HBO boss said. It's supposed to come out in like 2022 at the latest, at the
yeah,
earliest, I think, or the
yeah,
latest.
yeah. So, I mean, it's just casting. Okay. All right. What have you heard?
So this kind of annoys me because I was really, really wanting them to not do this yet. Because I want Fire and Blood to last years,
Hmm.
but of course, I in order for it to last years, I think they should start at the very beginning of Fire and Blood, which we're covering. And
Yeah.
that they need to start with Aegon's conquest all the way up to Robert's rebellion. That would last at least 7 to 8 years, of course, right?
Yeah.
But apparently, according to some of the rumors, they're casting for Rhaenyra and Alicent,
Um, okay.
which means
So,
Dance of the Dragons, which is like
right.
mid towards the late Fire and Blood.
Right. I mean, Queen Alicent appears before the dance a little bit in the Rogue Prince era, but time, but yes, you're talking about lead up to the dance and the dance.
which,
Yeah.
I mean, there isn't a lot of insanity going on from like Aegon's conquest to, Dance of the Dragons when you compare it to A Song of Ice and Fire, because it always seems
Mm.
like there's way more happening in Song of Ice and Fire. White Walkers, uh, Dragon Apocalypse, amongst so many other things happening, and with
Yeah.
Fire and Blood, what the only thing ever happening is dragons every now and then burning things and the Faith Militant going crazy.
Well, I'm trying to think of like what they can do with that period. So, I mean, okay. So if you're talking about lead up to the dance and then the dance being the show, then your final season would be just this epic bloodbath of dragon fire everywhere. I suppose they could like that.
It would have
And
to be a mini series, at least 3 seasons, but I don't want it to be 3 seasons. I want it to be like 7 seasons and go on for a long time.
yeah, I mean the dance itself takes about a year, or a year and a half. Um, so I mean, you could stretch it out a little bit, have the last 3 seasons be the dance, and then have like first 2 seasons be a lead up. I mean, stuff happens in the Rogue Prince time. I mean, there's a uh, Daemon Targaryen goes off and fights in some wars, and with the three sisters, Lysmere and Tyrosh, and some other some other stuff can go on. There's plenty of like relationships and scheming and things like that can go on with you know uh, Kristen Cole and Rhaenyra and Corlys Velaryon and all these sorts of things they can get into.
But here's the
So
problem
I
with
mean,
it.
yeah,
That all focuses on one specific group of people, maybe two or three. But with Game of Thrones, there's like so many point of views. You have, each of
yeah,
the Stark children have their own point of view, and then some of the Lannisters do, and then Targaryens in the east, and then you have occasionally Ironborn and Dornish, and then
yeah.
we're in the Vale. There's so many point of views that are very interesting and all over the place. Whereas a lot of the times in Fire and Blood, we really only follow the Targaryen kings, occasionally
Right.
their
You're
sisters.
just in you're in King's Landing, and then for a second you might be somewhere else. But there's no long extended period of time of having two locations where action is taking place. I mean, maybe one could argue like wherever Dreamfire Reina is, and wherever and what's happening in King's Landing and what's happening on Dragonstone, but um, you're right that it's not like Ice and Fire where you have these diverse locations with all sorts of stuff going on.
And there's a bunch of interesting characters who normally shouldn't be in those places but are in those places. One of the most randomest things in Ice and Fire ever, and I think you'll agree with me, is when you're at It was the Dance of Dragons chapter, the Sacrifice, which is an Asha
Yeah,
chapter, and out of the fucking blue, a Bravosi banker just shows up, just
yeah,
out of the blue, and even she comments on how that was incredibly random. At the almost at the end
yeah.
of the world, in this frozen wasteland, there's a Bravosi banker over there looking for Stannis. Like what?
Yeah, one of the great things about the multiple point of view system is when the characters finally meet. We then get this intricate, layered interaction of the plots. It's very difficult to do to write multiple point of views successfully. Generally, when we read, we identify with a single
Mm.
protagonist. So if you start switching the point of view, we get exhausted and it's hard to identify with each of them. And if you're reading a multiple point of view book, you're often trying to go really fast and breeze through the chapters you don't care about in order to get back to the point of view that you do. And
God, that's
so,
so true.
sure,
The Brienne chapters in Feast. Oh
sure,
my.
absolutely, absolutely. It's actually something they try to tell you in like writing 101. It's to write one point of view. And so expert writers, they kind of say, oh, I'm going to show you all. I'm going to write multiple point of views. Plus, they like multiple point of views because it translates to TV shows and movies and miniseries better where all of the money is. We're able to deal with it better visually than we are as, as readers. But I love the plots colliding in the Wayward Bride and the King's Prize and the Sacrifice chapter. I love when Stannis arrives in the Jon chapters in A Storm of Swords. It's just really fun and neat when a story from 1,000 miles away comes in and alters the course of a different story. And these sorts of meetings did happen in the later seasons of Game of Thrones, and they made a big deal out of these things. Stark family reunion, Jon finally meets Dany, Tyrion meets Dany, but they kind of fell flat and didn't feel like multiple plots coming together. They felt like a few characters spinning their wheels and it all being part of a different character's story. I mean, Arya was just sitting on her hands at Winterfell. Theon and Asha didn't really affect the Dany plot at all. They just became these background
You
characters.
mentioned Tyrion and Danny. Uh, well, from what like John, you mentioned John and Danny, but Tyrion and Danny meeting up, like everyone was like, "Yeah, all right, he drinks and he knows things. This is the what we've been waiting for." And it was kind of like their first conversation is them sitting down, and she goes into that weird. Looking back on it now, is very cringe. Like this one's on top and that one's on top. I'm not gonna stop the wheel. I'm gonna break it. I feel like sometimes they just put those really cringy lines in there for the trailer and only for the trailer.
Sure, sure. And I was thinking back in the show when everybody was really hyping and thinking about how everything was going to be different once Sansa got to the wall and finally met Jon and those two plots collided. And when it happened, it was a big snooze and there was all this awkward silence. It took an entire season for everybody to kind of come together and eventually attack Winterfell. And this is very different than, say, Stannis arriving and immediately shaking up everything at the wall. Or even the character of Tycho Nestoris arriving in Stannis' camp in the books and completely changing everything. When another character arrives, you're expecting them to be an element that causes a massive shift in the
Mm-hmm.
winds. But when Tyrion finally makes it to Dany, his arrival doesn't really affect anything. Or when the Greyjoys arrive, they don't really affect anything. Or Sansa and Brienne showing up at the wall, like it doesn't affect anything all at once. It takes many, many episodes. And it feels like the progression of one plot rather than two plots changing. Attacking Ramsay and Winterfell, that's not Jon's story. It just didn't feel like plots colliding, in a big ruckus in the show. And that's one of the cool things about the book is when the plots that two narratives will collide and drastically change, like Sam running into Arya and both of their plots being very different.
Like I said, I think the best way to handle this would be an anthology series because one of the things, because I was actually thinking about this the other day, I hated the treatment of the Blackfish. I thought it was one of the most disrespectful things you can do to a book character. Like at least Stannis, like yeah, they treated him like badly, but at least you got to kind of see his defeat. The Blackfish just takes out a sword and says, "I'm gonna go fight." And the next scene is like Jamie saying, "The Blackfish, bring him to me. He died fighting, sir." Like, what? You don't even see it. Like, that's such a disrespect. And the
It
reason I
was
think they
as
did that,
exciting as his escape from the twins.
The reason I think they did that is because they had to give so much money of the budget to the actors to stay in the show that I don't think they could have afforded that character or that actor for a long period of time. With an anthology series, you can just swap, like Aegon the Conqueror. I don't see him going past season 1. You know, like of Visenya, I don't see her going past season 2. Like
I mean, from what you're telling me, they're just going to do the dance, or at least they should. I mean, I don't think they're going
I
to be
hope not.
jumping around like
I
anthology
hope not.
style. Like starting with Aegon's Conquest.
Fuck.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, to be fair, we don't start A Song of Ice and Fire at the very beginning of like Robert's Rebellion or even Aegon's Conquest. We started towards the very end of the second century of Aegon's Conquest. So
Yeah, but you're right that there's not the multiple locations, and that's going to be an issue. I mean, with the actual Dance of the Dragons, when they finally get into the war, there are multiple locations, but it's not multiple locations simultaneously. They're
mhm.
kind of in succession. The war moves from this place and then moves to that place. You don't think about too many things going on that are simultaneous, at least not to the same degree as Ice and Fire. And so when I'm thinking about things like what's going on in the Rogue Prince era and the lead up to the dance, I mean, that's really interesting stuff, but at the same time, I'm not wondering what's going on with the Starks. I mean, the Starks don't show up until the very end of the dance, and whatever plot they have going on seems completely unrelated to everything going on at King's Landing and Dragonstone. I mean, unless they're talking about seriously like changing the source material or extrapolating on it, we don't really know what the Starks are doing at this time. So yeah, I mean, I don't really know how they're
If
going to do it.
anything, I could see this being like 1 or 2 seasons, like a mini series, or even like not even 1 or 2 seasons, maybe
Yeah.
4 episodes, like Band of Brothers. Like I don't for 5 episodes. Like I don't see this being like a whole thing. Well, that's not true. They did announce they're gonna do 10 episodes, but can you do more than 10 episodes with Dance of Dragons?
I don't
Maybe,
know. I
but not a lot
mean,
of seasons.
the spin-offs are kind of hit and miss. I mean, whether they're going to be successful or not. I mean, right? I mean, for every Frasier that runs 11 seasons, I'm not saying Frasier's a great show, but it was successful. It ran 11 seasons. But for every one of those, there's Joey. I mean, for, every Better Call Saul, there's, a Caprica or there's a Golden Palace, that was a spin-off of the Golden Girls. I mean, there are some really successful spin-offs. I mean, the Jeffersons was a spin-off. And I mean, there's a bunch of others, and Better Call Saul is a great example of a good one. But for the most part, they just don't make it.
It's very rare.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's going to be too successful. People might be tired of it, and I mean, we might get one or maybe even two seasons, but it's probably going to cost just as much as Game of Thrones and not end up getting the same ratings.
The prospect of that bothers me because I want more Thrones on the screen, but
But at the
fuck.
same time, they'll be looking for new things. One big thing for renewals and extensions is what other things does HBO have? So in 2021, we might have what may be the last season of Westworld. So they might want a big show replacement in 2022.
You think so? Last season? Because I thought they said they wanted to go like to season 5.
Maybe, maybe. I mean, they really trimmed the budget for season 3 compared to seasons 1 and 2. So maybe they're capable. I know the big issue was that it wasn't getting the ratings for what it was costing.
Hmm.
Season 1 I know cost just a boatload. They were paying all this money for Anthony Hopkins and all of these top-notch actors. And so by season 3, they were like, let's just keep this tight little cast. Get rid of the huge, expensive ensemble. But, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens with this Fire and Blood Dance of the Dragons. They'll probably waste all of their money on CGI dragons.
And get nothing in return. I mean, hopefully by then, because the Game of Thrones hype is dying down. Season 8 was not well received, no matter how many times the actors and actresses want to go on like talk shows and say how much everybody worked hard on it.
Yeah, no, I'll tell you this. I was watching, did you see the Kimmy Schmidt movie?
Fuck no.
It was okay. So the Kimmy Schmidt movie on Netflix, It's a choose your own adventure movie, kind of like that
Mm.
Dark Mirror movie.
Mm-hmm.
It's like Bandersnatch. Anyway, in Kimmy Schmidt, so there's this one scene. You know how every show has a stupid character? Well, one of the stupid characters says, "Oh, what have I been up to since you last saw me?" Well, I went to Hollywood and I got a job as a writer on this show. It was called Game of Thrones, and they took all of my ideas for the last season. So from that, we can see that the default opinion is anyone watching the show should know that season 8 was horrible. That joke would only work if like everyone in society, even people that didn't watch the show, knew that season 8 was bad.
Mm-hmm.
They can't undo that with these interviews. It's like popular opinion. So even if you've never seen Game of
Well,
Thrones, like my wife, you're still gonna know that that's a thing.
that is true. I know a guy who's never seen Thrones and he wanted to watch it, but because he heard such a bad, rumor and hype about what happened with season 8, he just doesn't want to watch it anymore, which is a goddamn shame because I think the first 5 seasons are amazing, but no, but hopefully by the time Thrones comes back in 2022, 2021 would have passed and we got Winds of Winter to, bring the hype back up because you need that hype.
Yeah, yeah, like a Winds of Winter that has a violently different plot than what's been presented on Game of Thrones.